Dax Alverson gripped the control panel with both hands as the celestial dawn bucked and jolted beneath him. The ship's once smooth journey through the stars had descended into chaos in the blink of an eye. He had faced plenty of challenges as a pilot in his time. Rogue asteroids, malfunctioning engines, pirate raids. But none of that compared to what was happening now. "This is supposed to be a routine trip," he muttered under his breath, struggling to stabilize the ship as alarms blared in his ears. The sudden energy surge from a nearby star system had come out of nowhere, throwing them off course and scrambling the ship's systems. Dax's eyes flicked to the navigation console. The display was a mess of scrambled coordinates, error messages flashing across the screen. He slammed his fist against the console, but it was no use. The ship was caught in the gravitational pull of a rogue planet, one that wasn't on any known star maps. "Great, just great," he grumbled, trying to reroute power to the thrusters. But before he could do much, another violent jolt rocked the ship, and the console sparked and went dead. In the passenger compartment behind him, Dax could hear the muffled voices of the Zythian ambassadors. He had barely interacted with them since they'd boarded back at the station, but he couldn't help noticing how strange they were. Zythians were humanoid, yes, but there was something distinctly ethereal about them. The way their skin shimmered under the light, the faint glow in their eyes, the strange melodic tone of their voices. They had an almost otherworldly beauty that made Dax feel like he was staring at living art. But now was not the time to be thinking about that. Right now, he had to get them through this alive. Dax slammed his hand on the intercom button. "Everyone brace for impact. We're going down." He barely had time to strap himself into his seat before the ship's descent accelerated. The view outside the cockpit was a blur of dark clouds and flashes of strange green lightning. The planet's surface rushed up to meet them, jagged and desolate, its features barely visible in the storm that seemed to rage across its skies. The ship hit the atmosphere with a deafening roar. Metal groaned and screeched as the freighter plummeted. Dax fought the controls, trying to angle the ship's nose up to soften the crash landing. The hull vibrated violently, and he could hear something tearing loose behind him. "Hold together, baby, just a little longer," he whispered through gritted teeth. The last thing Dax remembered was the planet's surface rushing toward them, then a bone-rattling impact. The world went black. When Dax woke up, the first thing he noticed was the silence. No alarms, no roaring engines, no static over the intercom. Just an eerie stillness. Slowly, he opened his eyes, his head throbbing from the crash. The cockpit was dark, the controls dead. He could feel the weight of his body pressing into the seat, the straps that had kept him alive during the crash, now digging uncomfortably into his chest. With a groan, Dax unclipped himself and stumbled to his feet. The front viewports were shattered, offering a view of the planet they had crashed on. The landscape outside was harsh and alien. Jagged black rocks jutted out of the ground, and in the distance, massive mountains loomed under a strange greenish sky. A thick fog seemed to blanket the horizon, and the air shimmered with an unnatural glow. He turned to check the rest of the ship. The cargo bay and passenger compartments were mostly intact, though debris was scattered everywhere. The Zythian ambassadors, his unusual passengers, had survived, though a few of them looked shaken. They moved with an unsettling calmness, as if this kind of disaster was no more than an inconvenience. Their leader, Lyvira, was already tending to one of her companions, who had a gash on her arm. Dax approached her cautiously. "Everyone okay?" Lyvira looked up, her silver blue eyes catching the light in a way that made them almost glow. "We are unharmed, Captain," she said softly, her voice smooth and melodious despite the situation. "You saved us from the worst of the crash." Dax rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Wasn't sure we were going to make it. Do any of you know where we are?" One of the other Zethians, a woman with deep emerald skin and intricate gold markings running down her arms, spoke up. "This world, it is not one we have encountered before. It is old, though, very old." Dax raised an eyebrow. "Old? What do you mean by that?" The woman turned her gaze to the horizon, her eyes narrowing as if she could sense something beyond sight. "There is a presence here, deep beneath the surface. It feels ancient. Dax wasn't sure how to take that. He had dealt with plenty of weird alien species in his time, but there was something unsettling about the way the Zethians talked. Still, now wasn't the time to dwell on that. He had more immediate concerns, like surviving. Dax moved quickly to assess the situation. The ship was beyond repair, its systems fried from the crash. The comms were down, and there was no way to send a distress signal. Whatever had hit them during the flight had completely knocked out their long-range communication. Worse still, the planet's atmosphere was strange, heavy with static and charged particles that interfered with their technology. "We're stuck here for now," Dax said grimly, addressing the group of Zethian women who had gathered around. "I don't know how long it'll take before we can get a signal out, but we need to focus on survival first." Levira stepped forward, her expression serene despite the circumstances. "We will assist you, Captain. Our skills may be of use in this environment." Dax nodded, though he wasn't quite sure what she meant by skills. He'd seen some of their technology before boarding the freighter, and while it was advanced, he wasn't sure how much it would help in a situation like this. Still, they didn't have any other options. "First things first," Dax said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We need to secure shelter and find food. Let's see what we can salvage from the ship." The group spread out, searching through the wreckage for anything useful. Dax managed to find a few crates of rations, though they wouldn't last long. He also salvaged some tools, a blaster, and a portable power generator that might help them get some of the ship's systems running again. As they worked, Dax couldn't help but notice the way the Zethians moved. They were graceful, almost too graceful, like they were dancing through the debris rather than walking. Every now and then, one of them would glance at the sky or the mountains in the distance, as if they were sensing something Dax couldn't perceive. By the time they had finished gathering supplies, night had fallen, or at least what passed for night on this strange planet. The twin suns had sunk below the horizon, and the sky had darkened to a deep indigo, with strange, swirling auroras flickering above. Dax stood by the fire they had built from the wreckage, staring out at the alien landscape. The silence of the planet was unnerving. No wind, no animals, no sound at all, except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional murmur of the Zethians as they spoke in their soft, melodic language. He didn't want to admit it, but the isolation was starting to get to him. He was stranded on an uncharted world with 20 alien women who seemed as much a mystery as the planet itself, and something told him that their problems were only just beginning. The dawn on this strange planet was unlike anything Dax had ever seen. 2 suns, one blue and one orange, crept over the horizon, casting an eerie, shifting light across the jagged landscape. As the light bathed the wreckage of the celestial dawn, the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, making the already alien terrain feel even more surreal. Dax wiped the sweat from his brow. Despite the cool night before, the twin suns quickly heated the surface to an uncomfortable level. He was already exhausted, having barely slept. His mind kept replaying the crash over and over, and now the constant awareness that they were stranded with limited resources gnawed at him. As he surveyed the wreckage, Levira approached him. Her ethereal beauty was even more striking in the daylight. The iridescent markings on her sapphire blue skin shimmered in the sunlight, and her long silver hair fluttered slightly, as if an invisible breeze played through it. Her presence was calming but also unnerving. Dax could never tell what she was thinking. "Captain," she said softly, breaking the silence, "we have scouted the nearby area and found water. The planet is not barren. There is life here." Dax turned, surprised. "Life? What kind of life?" Levira's silver blue eyes gleamed. "Nothing hostile, at least not yet. The forest to the west holds a stream, and plants of unusual properties grow there. We will need to test them for edibility, but the signs are promising." Dax's brow furrowed. "Good news, I guess, but I don't trust this place. It feels too strange, too quiet. We need to be on guard." Levira nodded in agreement, but her expression was calm, as if nothing could truly disturb her. "We Zethians are attuned to the balance of nature, Captain. I assure you we will sense danger before it strikes." Dax wasn't so sure. As a pilot, he relied on tech, strategy, and instinct. But these women operated on a whole different wavelength, literally. He had witnessed some of their abilities during the crash, though he hadn't fully processed it at the time. Now, he couldn't afford to ignore the fact that they had powers far beyond what he was used to. He felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to see another Zithian woman, Zira, standing there. Her skin was a deep emerald green, with golden markings running like veins down her arms and neck. Her eyes, wide and glowing faintly, seemed to reflect the surrounding environment like liquid mirrors. "I've taken a sample of the plant life from the forest," she said, holding up a small vial of luminous green liquid. "I believe it may help us restore some of the ship's power. It contains high concentrations of bioenergy." Dax stared at the vial, not quite comprehending. "Bioenergy? You're saying that stuff could recharge our systems?" Zira nodded. "Possibly. Our technology on Zithia harnesses natural energy flows, and this planet's plants seem to store a vast amount of it. We may be able to power the comms or other systems temporarily." Dax blinked. "That's incredible." He was used to thinking in terms of fuel cells and generators, but the Zithians were offering something far beyond what he'd ever seen. He still couldn't get his head around the fact that they were stranded on an uncharted world with not only alien life forms, but alien technology and powers that defied explanation. "If we can get the comms working," Dax said, "we might have a chance of calling for rescue. It's a long shot, but it's the best plan we've got right now." Zira gave a small, confident smile. "I'll begin synthesizing the bioenergy and see if we can integrate it into the ship's systems." Dax watched as she moved back toward the wreckage, already immersed in her task. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of awe. These women weren't just stunning. They were brilliant, resourceful, and far more capable than he'd initially assumed. As the day wore on, Dax found himself working closely with the Zithians to organize their survival efforts. They divided tasks among themselves with seamless efficiency. Some of the women used their abilities to manipulate the planet's natural resources, drawing water from the atmosphere, creating makeshift tools from the surrounding flora, and even using their energy-based powers to form rudimentary shelters. Dax felt like a bystander at times, outclassed by their strange abilities, but he focused on what he could do, repairing the ship's systems, salvaging tech, and keeping an eye on the perimeter. It wasn't long before the first real test of their partnership came. Late in the afternoon, while Dax and Levira were discussing the possibility of setting up solar collectors to boost the ship's power, a loud rumble shook the ground beneath them. Dax instinctively grabbed his blaster and scanned the horizon. "What the hell was that?" Levira stood still, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to focus on something far away. "Something stirs in the mountains," she said quietly. "It is not a natural disturbance." Suddenly, a voice called out from one of the Zithian scouts who had ventured further out into the forest. "Captain, over here!" Dax and Levira rushed to the source of the commotion. When they arrived, Dax saw one of the Zithians standing over a large, half-buried structure made of dark stone. The structure had clearly been concealed for eons, but the recent tremor had dislodged part of the ground, revealing what looked like a doorway carved with intricate alien symbols. Dax knelt down to inspect it. "What is this place?" Levira crouched beside him, tracing her fingers along the ancient symbols. "This planet, it was once inhabited. Long ago. The energy I sensed beneath the surface, it is connected to this place." Dax frowned, feeling a chill creep up his spine. "Inhabited by who?" Levira shook her head. "I do not know, but their presence lingers, even in death." Before Dax could say anything, the ground rumbled again. This time, it wasn't just a tremor. From the doorway of the ancient structure, something began to stir, something large. The air grew thick with tension, and the shadows around the doorway seemed to ripple, as if alive. "Back up," Dax ordered, raising his blaster. But Levira didn't move. Instead, she raised her hand and closed her eyes, as if listening to something only she could hear. "The energy is waking," she whispered. "But it is not hostile, yet." Dax didn't lower his weapon. That's not exactly comforting. Suddenly the doorway burst open with a loud crack, and from within, a creature emerged. It was massive, serpentine in shape, its body covered in shimmering scales that reflected the twin suns' light. Its eyes were large, glowing orbs that seemed to see through Dax and Leavira, as though they were nothing but mist. Dax's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could fire, Leavira stepped forward, raising her arms in a gesture of peace. "Wait," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It is a guardian, not an enemy." The creature hissed, its long body coiling and uncoiling, but it did not attack. Instead, it stared at Leavira, its eyes locking with hers in a strange, silent communication. For what felt like an eternity, neither moved. Finally, the creature slithered back into the structure, disappearing into the darkness from which it came. Dax let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "What the hell was that?" Leavira turned to him, her face calm as ever. "An ancient guardian. This planet holds more secrets than we imagined. We will need to tread carefully." Dax shook his head, feeling overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of it all. "This place keeps getting weirder by the minute, but at least it didn't eat us." Leavira offered a small smile. "No, Captain, it did not." As they returned to the camp, Dax realized just how precarious their situation had become. The Zethians had remarkable abilities, but this planet was far from safe. The hidden dangers beneath the surface were waking, and it was only a matter of time before they encountered something far more dangerous than a passive guardian. "We'll need to watch each other's backs," Dax said as they approached the camp. "This place isn't what it seems, and I have a feeling things are going to get a lot more dangerous." Leavira nodded, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Yes, Captain. We must rely on one another if we are to survive." Dax felt the weight of her words and the truth behind them. Stranded on an uncharted world with no way to call for help, surrounded by ancient secrets and alien powers, survival was going to take everything he had, and more. And with the Zethians by his side, it was clear that his journey had only just begun. The eerie glow of the planet's twin moons bathed the camp in pale light. Dax sat by the fire, adjusting the ship's damaged communication systems with focused intensity. His hands moved quickly, stripping wires, reconnecting circuits, and testing power supplies in hopes of getting something, anything, to work. The bioenergy Zira had synthesized earlier had been partially successful. The comms now hummed with faint static, but a coherent signal was still out of reach. Every so often, Dax would glance over at the Zythian ambassadors. They were gathered in small groups around the camp, speaking softly in their strange melodic language. The way they moved, the way they interacted, it all felt so alien. Not just their appearance, with their glowing skin and ethereal eyes, but the way they seemed so calm, so in tune with the planet's strange energy. Even now, after everything, they appeared at ease, as if this entire experience was just another part of their journey. Dax rubbed his tired eyes and leaned back, staring up at the strange, swirling sky. The planet's atmosphere was unlike any he'd encountered before, shimmering with an almost otherworldly energy. A faint sense of unease gnawed at him, something he couldn't quite shake. The planet was too quiet, too still, like the calm before a storm. "Captain," a voice broke his thoughts. Dax turned to see Leavira standing beside him, her silver-blue skin glowing softly in the moonlight. Her presence was soothing, yet unsettling, a contradiction that seemed to define the Zythians. "You seem troubled," she said, her gaze piercing. Dax sighed and ran a hand through his short, dark hair. "I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone here, that something's watching us." Leavira tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "You are not wrong, Captain. This planet, it is alive in ways you cannot see. There is a presence beneath the surface." Dax straightened. "What do you mean? Is it dangerous?" She hesitated for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "The energy I sense is not immediately hostile, but it is old, older than any civilization we know. There are forces at work here, dormant for now, but I fear they may soon awaken." Dax frowned, his mind racing. "Awaken? From what?" Before Leavira could answer, the ground beneath them trembled, a low, deep rumble that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. Dax jumped to his feet, his instincts kicking in. His hand flew to the blaster at his side. "What the hell?" he muttered. Levira's eyes narrowed, her glowing irises reflecting the firelight. "It has begun," she said quietly. The tremor grew stronger, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Around the camp, the other Zithians stood, their serene expressions shifting to ones of concern. Some raised their hands, summoning faint ripples of energy around them as if preparing for an attack. Dax's heart raced as the tremor evolved into a full-blown quake. The ground cracked in places, and from the fissures, strange creatures began to emerge. Long, serpentine beings with sleek, segmented bodies. Their skin shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the same glow as the planet's atmosphere. Their eyes, large and glowing, locked onto the camp with an unnatural intelligence. "Everyone, fall back!" Dax shouted, raising his blaster. The creatures slithered out of the cracks with alarming speed, their bodies undulating as they closed in on the group. Dax fired a shot, the blast of energy hitting one of the creatures square in the chest. It recoiled, but quickly recovered, its glowing eyes narrowing as if irritated by the attack. "Levira!" Dax shouted, his voice tight with tension. "Any ideas?" Levira stepped forward, her hands raised. The air around her shimmered, and a pulse of energy radiated from her body, creating a protective barrier around the camp. The creatures hissed, recoiling from the barrier, but they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to circle, their movements growing more aggressive. "They are drawn to the energy," Levira said, her voice strained as she maintained the barrier. "We must not use our powers too much, or we will only feed them." Dax's mind raced. These creatures, whatever they were clearly connected to the planet's strange energy. But what did they want? And why now, after days of quiet? As the Zythians formed a defensive circle, each using their unique abilities to hold the creatures at bay, Dax noticed something else. One of the Zithians, Zira, was missing. "Where's Zira?" he shouted, scanning the camp. One of the other ambassadors pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "She was pulled into the fissure." Dax's heart sank. Without thinking, he bolted toward the fissure, dodging one of the serpentine creatures as it lunged at him. He could hear Levira calling after him, but he didn't stop. If Zira was trapped underground, he wasn't going to leave her there. The fissure was larger than he'd realized, a gaping crack in the earth that descended into darkness. Without hesitation, Dax leaped down, landing hard on the uneven ground below. The air down here was colder, thicker, and the walls of the cavern glowed with faint bioluminescent light. "Zira," he called, his voice echoing through the tunnel. There was no response. Dax moved quickly, his blaster raised as he navigated the narrow, twisting passageways. The deeper he went, the more unsettling the surroundings became. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and runes that pulsed with an ancient energy. It was as if the planet itself was alive, watching him, testing him. Finally, he heard a faint sound, breathing. He followed it, rounding a corner to find Zira slumped against the wall of a large chamber. Her emerald green skin was pale, her golden markings dim. She looked up as Dax approached, her expression weak but determined. "Captain," she whispered, struggling to stand. Dax rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "What happened?" Zira winced, holding her side where a dark bruise had formed. "The creatures, they are guardians. This planet, it's a prison. They are not the danger. The true danger lies deeper." Dax's stomach churned. "Deeper? What do you mean?" Zira nodded weakly toward the far end of the chamber, where a massive stone door stood half open. Behind it, a strange, glowing orb hovered, pulsing with an ominous energy. "It's a containment field," she explained, her voice barely a whisper. "The planet uses it to hold something ancient. If we use too much of our powers, it will wake." Dax stared at the orb, a cold dread creeping up his spine. "What's inside?" Zira's eyes met his, fear flickering in their depths. "A being of immense power. It feeds on energy, on life itself. The more we use our abilities, the stronger it becomes. The planet's guardians were put here to protect it, to keep it sealed. But now the balance has been disturbed." Dax clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preventing something far worse. "We need to warn the others," he said, pulling Zira up. As they moved back toward the surface, the ground trembled again, this time with more intensity. Whatever was beneath them was waking up, and they were running out of time. By the time they reached the surface, the battle was in full swing. The Zythians had managed to hold off the creatures, but just barely. Levira's barrier was flickering, weakening under the strain of constant attacks. Dax and Zyra stumbled back into the camp, breathless. "Stop using your powers," Dax shouted, his voice carrying over the noise. The Zythians paused, confused, but Levira immediately lowered her hands, dispelling the barrier. The creatures hesitated for a moment, their glowing eyes scanning the camp as if reassessing the situation. Then, slowly, they began to retreat, slithering back into the fissures from which they had come. Lyavira turned to Dax, her expression both relieved and puzzled. "What did you find?" Dax took a deep breath, glancing at Zyra before speaking. "This planet isn't just a place we crashed on. It's a prison. There's something down there, something powerful. If we keep using our abilities, we're going to wake it." Lyavira's eyes widened in realization. "The energy beneath the surface. It's feeding on us," Dax said grimly. "We have to stop, or we're going to unleash something far worse than those creatures." The camp fell silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. They were trapped on a planet that was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And now, their very survival depended on keeping the ancient force beneath the surface contained. Dax looked out at the jagged mountains in the distance, their peaks barely visible under the glow of the twin moons. Somewhere out there, something powerful and ancient was waiting to be unleashed, and it was only a matter of time before the planet woke it up. The camp was eerily quiet as the twin suns began to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. Dax stood near the wreckage of the celestial dawn, staring at the fissures that had opened in the ground during the night. His mind raced with the knowledge of what lay beneath them, a powerful, ancient being sealed deep within the planet, one that fed on energy. Every moment they spent on this world was a step closer to awakening it. Around him, the Zythians moved with a new sense of urgency. Their calm, ethereal demeanor from before had shifted, replaced by an understanding of the gravity of their situation. They had seen firsthand the creatures that guarded the planet's secret, and now they understood the danger they faced. Lyavira approached Dax, her expression grave. "We must act quickly, Captain. The tremors are becoming more frequent. The balance is already tipping." Dax nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, but without our powers, we're sitting ducks, and if we use them, we risk waking whatever is down there." Lyavira's silver-blue eyes narrowed as she glanced at the fissures, the ancient energy still radiating from beneath the surface. "There may be another way. Zyra has spoken of the containment field. If we can reach it, we might be able to stabilize the energy, keep the entity dormant." Dax stared at her, considering the idea. "You're suggesting we go down there? Into the heart of this prison?" Lyavira didn't flinch. "It is our only option. The planet is waking up, Captain. If we do nothing, it will awaken fully. And once that happens, there will be no stopping it." Dax sighed, rubbing his temples. The weight of leadership was heavy on his shoulders, and the decision to descend into the unknown was not one he took lightly. But Lyavira was right. They had no choice. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with determination. "We go down there, but we need a plan. We don't even know what we're dealing with." Lyavira's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained serious. "We Zythians are attuned to energy, Captain. We can guide you through the depths. Together we will find the core and stabilize it." Dax wasn't sure how much faith he had in their attunement to the planet's energy, but there was no time to debate. He gathered the group, laying out the plan quickly and efficiently. The Zythians would use their abilities sparingly, enough to shield and guide them, but not enough to draw the attention of the slumbering entity below. Hours later, Dax, Lyavira, and a small group of Zythians stood at the edge of the largest fissure. The ground was still trembling faintly beneath their feet, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked below. Zyra, despite her earlier injury, was among them, determined to see the mission through. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Dax asked, his concern evident as he glanced at Zira. She nodded, her deep emerald skin glowing faintly in the dim light. "I will be fine, Captain. This is something we must do." Dax gave a curt nod and motioned for them to begin. One by one they descended into the fissure, their footsteps echoing off the walls of the narrow cavern. The further they went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with energy and an unsettling sense of watchfulness. As they ventured deeper, the bioluminescent light grew stronger, illuminating the strange symbols and markings that covered the walls. It was clear now that this place wasn't just a natural cavern. It was a constructed containment, a prison designed to hold something far beyond their comprehension. Finally, they reached the chamber Dax had discovered with Zira earlier. The massive stone door stood half open, and beyond it, the glowing orb pulsed ominously, its energy filling the air with a low, thrumming hum. "This is it," Zira whispered, her eyes fixed on the orb. "The core of the containment field." Levira stepped forward, her hands outstretched as she reached out with her senses. "The energy is unstable," she murmured. "We need to stabilize it, or the entity will break free." Dax stood by her side, feeling utterly out of his depth. This was far beyond anything he had encountered in his career as a pilot, and yet here he was, about to face an ancient cosmic force with nothing but a blaster and a group of alien women with abilities he barely understood. "How do we stabilize it?" he asked, glancing between Levira and Zira. Zira took a deep breath. "We can merge our energies with the core, reinforce the containment, but it will take all of us, every Zithian, and we must be careful. If we push too hard, we could shatter the field entirely." Dax's gut twisted. "And if we fail?" Levira met his gaze, her expression grave. "Then we will all perish, and this entity will be unleashed upon the galaxy." No pressure, Dax thought grimly. The Zythians formed a circle around the glowing orb, each of them closing their eyes and raising their hands, their bodies glowing with faint ethereal light. Levira and Zira stood at opposite ends of the circle, their faces serene yet focused. Dax stood back, watching as the energy in the chamber began to shift. The glowing markings on the walls pulsed in time with the orb, and the ground beneath them trembled as the Zithians channeled their collective energy into the containment field. At first, it seemed to be working. The thrumming of the orb grew steadier, its pulsing light becoming more rhythmic. The trembling in the ground lessened, and for a moment Dax dared to hope that they might actually succeed. But then, the orb flared violently, sending a shockwave of energy through the chamber. The Zithians staggered, their concentration momentarily broken, and the ground shook more violently than before. Dax's heart raced as he watched Levira struggle to maintain control. "What's happening?" Levira gritted her teeth, her eyes still closed. "The entity is fighting back. It knows what we're trying to do." Zira cried out as a surge of energy shot through the circle, sending her to her knees. Dax rushed to her side, grabbing her arm and pulling her back to her feet. "Stay with me," he shouted over the rising din. "I'm trying," Zira gasped, her face pale. The orb pulsed again, this time sending cracks spiderwebbing across the chamber floor. Dax's stomach dropped as he realized the containment was beginning to fail. The entity was waking up, and they were losing control. "We can't hold it," Zira shouted, her voice strained with effort. Levira opened her eyes, her face etched with a grim realization. "Captain," she said, her voice low and steady, "we must make a final choice. We can pour all of our energy into the core and risk everything, or we can retreat now and escape while we still have the chance." Dax stared at her, his mind racing. If they retreated, the entity would eventually break free. It might take hours, days, or weeks, but it would happen. And when it did, there would be no stopping it. But if they stayed and pushed the core beyond its limits, they risked destroying everything, including themselves. He glanced at the Zythians, their faces strained with concentration and effort. These women had trusted him to lead them, to help them survive, and now he had to decide whether to risk their lives in one final desperate attempt to stop the entity. "No," Dax said firmly, his decision made. "We stop it, here and now." Levira nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "As you wish, Captain." The Zythians closed their eyes once more, and this time they poured everything they had into the containment field. The chamber filled with light, the air crackling with energy as the core pulsed faster and faster. Dax felt the ground shake beneath him, the walls of the chamber vibrating as the Zythian's energy merged with the core. The orb flared bright enough to blind him, and for a moment, Dax thought it would all end in a brilliant flash of light. But then, the shaking stopped. The light from the orb dimmed, its pulsing slowing to a steady, rhythmic hum. The cracks in the ground sealed themselves, and the markings on the walls glowed softly, stable once more. Dax blinked, his heart still pounding in his chest. Did we do it? Levira opened her eyes, her body swaying slightly with exhaustion. Yes, she said softly. We have stabilized the core. The entity remains dormant. The Zythians collapsed to the ground, spent but alive. Dax let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had done it. They had stopped the awakening, for now. Later, as they made their way back to the surface, Dax couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The entity may have been contained, but the knowledge that it still existed, buried beneath the planet's surface, was unsettling. As they emerged from the fissure, the twin suns rising once more, Levira stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. We may have succeeded today, she said quietly, but the danger is not gone. This planet will always hold its secrets. Dax nodded, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains. I know, but at least we've bought ourselves some time. Levira turned to him, a faint smile on her lips. Time is all we ever have, Captain. And now, we must use it wisely. Dax looked at the Zythians, their faces tired but triumphant. They had survived the impossible. Together, they had faced an ancient power and lived to tell the tale. But as they prepared to rebuild their camp and search for a way off the planet, Dax couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The entity below still slept, and someday it would wake again.